We're good? All right. Thank you all for coming. For tonight's discussion, 100 years later, how has the Immigration Act of 1924 changed America? My name is Bill Scher. I am the Vice President of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum here in Northampton, Massachusetts. I'm joined today by Dr. Rebecca Hamlin, University of Massachusetts Amherst Professor of Legal Studies and Political Science. She focuses her research on law and immigration politics and migrant categorization and the concept of a refugee. She is currently researching the intersection between immigration restrictionism and the expansion of Native American citizenship in 1924. She recently published the book Crossing: How We Label and React to People on the Move. And to her left, Dr. Razvan Sibi, also University of Massachusetts Amherst, senior lecturer in journalism. He researches and writes about issues of language, identity construction, immigration, and incarceration. He writes a monthly column about immigration for the Daily Hampshire Gazette and is a regular contributor to several Romanian language publications. This event is part of our Coolidge Centennial Series. To date, as part of the series, we have held discussions on When the President Dies, how Calvin Coolidge and others guided America through mourning, and 100 years after the Indian Citizenship Act, how has Native American life changed? Both are available to watch on the Forbes Library YouTube channel. Predating the Coolidge Centennial Series, we held a discussion on Coolidge and civil rights, which focused on Coolidge's record regarding the rights of African Americans, which I believe is worth watching in concert with our previous Native American panel and today's immigration discussion. And we have a Coolidge and Civil Rights webpage on the museum's website with primary sources and academic analyses of Coolidge's record in all of these areas if you want additional information. We here at the museum are not interested in telling you what to think. We're not here to tell you whether you should believe Coolidge was a good guy or a bad guy. We at the museum are hosting these events and collecting all this information because it is our mission to help people understand Coolidge, his record, and his era. And before we hear from our great panelists, I want to set the stage as to where the Immigration Act of 1924 came from. The first major law restricting immigration was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, barring immigration from China for 10 years and denying citizenship to Chinese workers already in America. President Chester Arthur initially vetoed the act, which was a 20-year ban, in part to maintain good trade relations with China. He was praised by the New York Times, but he was hung in effigy in the West. And under that political pressure, he reluctantly signed a version with a 10-year ban and a few loopholes. There was a frequent pen pal of Arthur's in New York City named Julia Sand. She was livid, and she wrote him, quote, "Why do you not do what you do with your whole soul, or have you only half of one? When you vetoed the Chinese bill, the better class of people throughout the country were delighted. Now you sign it. It is contrary to the spirit of our institutions and the civilization of the age." It gives you a little bit of a flavor of the debate at the time. There's a derogatory phrase, hyphenated American, that was popularized in the 1890s as immigration increased from Southern and Eastern Europe, including people from Germany, Italy, Poland, as well as from Ireland. The insinuation was that people in ethnic enclaves were not assimilating and becoming fully American. There was an 1899 editorial cartoon titled The Hyphenated American, which depicted men with ethnic attire on half of their bodies, lining up at a ballot box, and the caption, "Why should I let these freaks cast whole votes when they are only half Americans?" In the eyes of many Americans, the immigrants were associated with socialism, anarchy, alcohol consumption, and political violence. In 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated by a Polish-American anarchist, though he was born in America. In 1915, Teddy Roosevelt gave a speech where he said, the one absolutely certain way of bringing this nation to ruin, of preventing all possibility of its continuing to be a nation at all, would be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities. an intricate knot of German Americans, Irish Americans, English Americans, French Americans, Scandinavian Americans, or Italian Americans, each preserving its separate nationality, each at heart feeling more sympathy with Europeans of that nationality than with the other citizens of the American Republic. The men who do not become Americans and nothing else are hyphenated Americans, and there ought to be no room for them in this country. Anti-immigrant sentiment intensified during the latter half of the 1910s with war against Germany, the Communist Revolution in Russia, and a spate of anarchist bombings in the U.S. perpetrated by an Italian-American terrorist group, which culminated in a very deadly bombing of Wall Street in 1920. But immigrants tended to vote Democratic. When Congress passed legislation in 1915 imposing literacy tests on immigrants, President Woodrow Wilson issued a veto. He said in a 1915 veto message, "The bill seeks to all but close entirely the gates of asylum, which have always been open to those who could find nowhere else the right and opportunity of constitutional agitation for what they conceive to be the natural and inalienable rights of men. And it excludes those to whom the opportunities of elementary education have been denied, without regard to their character, their purposes, or their natural capacity. Restrictions like these, adopted earlier in our history as a nation, would very materially have altered the course and cooled the humane ardors of our politics. The right of political asylum has brought to this country many a man of noble character and elevated purpose who was marked as an outlaw in his own less fortunate land, and who has yet become an ornament to our citizenship and to our public councils." But in 1917, one of his vetoes was overridden, imposing a literacy test and banning immigration from most Asian countries. Amidst this chaos, this perceived sense of chaos in 1920, a Republican ticket, Warren Harding with Calvin Coolidge, was elected, and they took a harder line on immigration. Soon after Harding's inauguration, he signed the Emergency Quota Act, temporarily establishing quotas on European immigration, limiting annual immigration from a particular country to 3% of the number of people from that country already in America. And that formula imposed stricter limits on Southern and Eastern European countries. In December 1922, in an address to Congress, Harding said, "Abusing the hospitality of our shores are the advocates of revolution, finding their deluded followers among those who take on the habiliments of an American without knowing the American soul. There is the recrudescence of hyphenated Americanism, which we thought to have been stamped out when we committed the nation, life, and soul to the World War. There is a call to make the alien respect our institutions while he accepts our hospitality. There is a need to magnify the American viewpoint to the alien who seeks a citizenship among us. There are pending bills for the registration of the alien who has come to our shores. I wish the passage of such an act might be expedited. Life amid American opportunities is worth the cost of registration if it is worth the seeking, and the nation has the right to know who are citizens in the making or who live among us and share our advantages while seeking to undermine our cherished institutions." Harding died of a heart attack in 1923, elevating Calvin Coolidge to the presidency. Congress was working on permanent legislation that would lower that quota standard from 3% to 2% and ban immigration from Japan, which was not banned in the 1917 bill. Coolidge's views on immigration were similar to Harding's. He said in his message to Congress in December 1923, "American institutions rest solely on good citizenship. They were created by people who had a background of self-government. New arrivals should be limited to our capacity to absorb them into the ranks of good citizenship. America must be kept American. For this purpose, it is necessary to continue a policy of restricted immigration." He signaled support for the forthcoming Immigration Act of 1924, reducing that quota from 3% to 2%. But similar to Chester Arthur's concern about offending China, Coolidge did not want to offend Japan. And similar to Arthur, he reluctantly signed the bill while issuing a statement expressing regret he could not take out the Japan ban. So that gives you, I think, a sense of how we got to 1924, the divide in the country, the overarching public sentiment. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Rebecca Hamblin.
Thank you so much. And I just want to apologize for my voice. I'm coming off of a cold, and this is all I have, so I'll do my best. So I wanted to talk about sort of three key things that I think are important to know about the Act, and then talk a little bit about the parallels with today, which I assume will also come up in the Q&A. But the first key thing is that, as Bill has already elaborated, the Act really represented 50 years of rising xenophobia coming to a head. It didn't come out of nowhere at all. It had built to that point over decades. And I agree with everything you said. And I would just add to it that there was also really palpable fear of Catholicism. There was a belief expressed widely in the xenophobic, in the anti-immigrant movement, that people who were Catholics or papists, as they were sometimes called, were not capable of being citizens of a democracy because they had an authoritarian view of the world, or they had an allegiance to another leader somewhere else in the form of the Pope. And so that was an added concern in addition to the anarchy and the communism and all of that. And while Asian immigration had been curtailed a lot on the West Coast from the Chinese Exclusion Acts, there was still anti-immigrant sentiment in California stemming from actually growing numbers of Sikh people from the Punjab province of India who were coming down into California from Canada, which was part of the British Empire at that point, and also a number of Japanese arrivals coming from the sugar plantations of Hawaii to the mainland. And so these very highly visible minorities in California were really stirring up concern about Asian immigration as well, beyond and above the already banned Chinese immigration. And so, yes, this was a moment of extreme xenophobia and assimilationist rhetoric, and it was really, I think, coming from this concern about the rising tide of color, concerns about the vanishing white race. This is a huge theme in that era, and it's really important to understand the narrow way in which whiteness was understood at that time. So whiteness was construed to be primarily Anglo-Saxon. Northern and Western Europe, and even Eastern and Southern Europeans were not considered white. There were lynchings of Italians in this period as well. So I'll sort of, some of the other assimilationist stuff I was going to say, you already said, so we're good. And I'll move on to the impacts of the Act. It had a massive impact. I would say, interestingly, I've done a lot of research on the media coverage of the Act at the time when it was passed, and there's very little except for the stuff about Japan. There were mass protests in Tokyo in the streets. Actually, several Japanese people committed suicide the week that the Act was passed in protest of the Act. They were extremely, the attitude in Japan was one of extreme offense. They took great offense to the idea that they would be seen as racially inferior to Americans and to be put in the same category as Chinese people. They were very, very deeply hurt, and so it was a diplomatic crisis. And that was the thing that got the most coverage in the newspaper at the time. But the biggest impact of the Act was essentially turning the clock back on the heavily Southern and Eastern European immigration that had been coming through Ellis Island at the rate of about 1 million people per year for the first couple decades of the 20th century. And it did that by limiting the number of people who could come after the Act was passed to a quota based on 2% of the amount of people counted in the 1890 census, not the 1920, which was the most recent census, but they turned the clock back 3 censuses in order to be able to, and because 1890 is right before the big wave of Eastern and Southern European immigration, and so the idea was, if we build our quotas around a moment in American history when we liked the racial makeup of the United States, then maybe we can reset it back to that point. And the practical effect of that system was to allocate 86% of all spots from 1924 on to people from Northern and Western Europe. And the irony there is that actually those quotas did not always fill, because those were not the people that were looking to immigrate to the United States. And so we immediately create quotas that are far below the demand from Eastern and Southern Europe. And so those quotas get mortgaged out decades, so that places like Estonia, Latvia, Hungary, Romania, you name it, we're looking at, if you applied for a visa from one of those countries in the 1930s, you're looking at like a 200-year wait list. So essentially impossible. And so people's options were to try to immigrate illegally or to not come at all. It also, just by virtue of the fact that it completely ended Asian immigration legally, cut to almost zero anything from any other part of the world, the Middle East and Africa, and then cut Europe down drastically. We're not just talking about a difference in the makeup of the immigrant population, but really 90% of the numbers were gone. The door, a congressman said, let's shut the door. We essentially shut the door in 1924. This directly led to the death of Jewish people who were trying to escape the Holocaust in the 1930s because they did not have a way to apply for a visa, and we did not yet at that time have a concept of a refugee that would allow them for an exception, like a humanitarian exception to the visa quotas. And because the act was kept in place for 40 years until it was replaced by the 1965 Act, it changed the demographics of America completely, and it's one of the reasons why by the time we get to the 1960 census, 88% of all foreign-born were classified as white. So most of the diversification of the United States that we've seen has been post-1965, i.e. when this act was removed. The third thing I want to say is that one of the biggest effects of the act was it launched a century-long and ongoing schizophrenic relationship with Mexico in terms of migrant labor, because this hemisphere had no numerical quotas. So the focus of the act was to shut the door on immigration through the Pacific and the Atlantic, but it didn't conceptualize any problem with migration within the Americas. And so because it got rid of low-wage immigrant labor from every other part of the world, there was suddenly a massive increase in demand for Mexican, or for migrant labor or low-wage labor in general, and that demand was filled by Mexico. And we basically, for the past 100 years, stayed in that relationship with Mexico where when we need labor, we encourage it, people come, and then when there's an economic downturn and we don't need people anymore, all of a sudden the enforcement apparatus comes out and there's raids and mass deportations. One of the most infamous examples of this is the Operation Wetback of the 1950s, which basically tried to remove all the people who had been filling positions in the United States that were needed by the war machine whilst American men were overseas. And then once the men came home, we kicked Mexican people out. But that's basically been the sort of relationship with Mexico that we've established over the course of a century. And then when Mexico finally got its own quota in 1965, after 4 decades of promoting Mexican migrant labor, all of a sudden the quota for Mexico was like 1% of the annual supply that we had already known were coming. And so this creates illegality in the form of a Mexican migrant labor force for the very first time. In other words, since U.S. fears were focused on East and West for so long, the problem of undocumented immigration from the Americas wasn't really a thing at all until the late 20th century, when it became the subject of a moral panic that continues to this day. And maybe I'll just pause there, and then if we want to talk about how much of today is a repeat of history, we can. I assume that was going to be one of your...
We'll definitely get there. Dr. Sibi, please.
Thank you. The drawback of speaking last is that all the good stuff has been said before, so what they said, basically. But I'll try to frame this discussion a little bit by going way back to the founding of the United States, around 1776, when Thomas Paine wrote his famous independence pamphlet, Common Sense. And in it, he said, quote, "Europe, not England, is the parent country of America." And he also said, "We claim brotherhood with every European Christian." Now, that was a very radical statement to make. Thomas Paine, of course, was a radical. He advocated for a lot of radical ideas, not least of all the independence of the colonies. to argue that Swedes and Germans and Dutch and French people were basically on the same level as Englishmen when it comes to their desirability and ability to assimilate in America was a radical statement to make. Now, he couldn't bring himself to think beyond Europe and beyond Christianity, even though he actually was not a Christian believer himself. But still, it was a statement of inclusivity, a vision of diversity for America, that it is not just a place where Englishmen can escape certain religious strictures back home, but rather a place where people from around Europe who believe in the same values and are willing to follow the rules are welcome, which is what we would recognize now as an incipient version of the American dream idea. Of course, that vision, it doesn't matter where you come from, what your ethnicity is, what religion you are, what language you speak, you're welcome in America if you follow the rules, was always matched by the opposite vision, was always accompanied by the nativist vision that said that America belongs to a certain kind of people. Sometimes this idea was expressed in crudely racist terms, in terms of one race, one ethnicity is superior to all others. Other times, more frequent, we had a particular code that spoke of ability to assimilate, that certain types of people were more likely to be able to assimilate, as you were talking about the hyphenated Americans. Some people were less likely to hold on to their to the cultures that they were born into, and they were willing to let go of such vices as a fondness for alcohol, propensity for violence, strange habits like eating our pets, and so on. That discourse was very much around from the very beginning, as was this other competing discourse of inclusivity. The 1924 Immigration Act that we're discussing here was represented a great victory for this other vision, the vision of exclusivity, as it drastically limited immigration from Southern Europe, which affected primarily and was meant to affect primarily Italian Americans, also affected others, Greeks and other peoples, but it was really aimed at Italian Americans who were perceived as coming in with socialist, anarchist ideas and representing a race that was inferior to Scandinavian and Germanic and Anglo-Saxon races, quote-unquote, as they saw it at the time, and also Eastern Europe, which was really meant to affect Jews who were escaping pogroms and ghettos, the ghettos of Eastern Europe, and the rise increasingly of fascist sentiment and the coming to power of fascist regimes on distinctly racial grounds. And as my colleague said, the act also solidified the exclusion of all immigration from Asia. The debate around the 1924 Act is uncomfortably similar to the debate around immigration these days, complete with such metaphors as an invasion from the hordes of either criminals or dirty or generally dangerous people, disease, poison, as in poisoning our blood, poisoning the blood of the nation, flood and other natural catastrophes, and garbage. The nativists then were able to successfully argue that immigrants from certain countries are a threat to civilization, are unable to assimilate into American life. They have odd habits that they're not willing to let go of, culinary practices as in what they eat, was part of the discourse. Promiscuous sexual habits, as well as questionable work ethic and propensity for crime. There are many similarities between 1924 and 2024, but there are also significant differences. Not least of all that the man who presided over the 1924 nativist victory, President Calvin Coolidge, was a very different man than the man who presides over the current nativist crisis, President-elect Donald Trump. And I'm sure we'll get into that analogy as well. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask Rebecca a question first. You talked about the racial element here, and Coolidge gave a speech in 1925, which reflects his assimilationist principles, where he said, and this is a few years after World War I ended, no man's patriotism was impugned or service questioned because of his racial origin, talking about service in the war. No man's patriotism was impugned or service questioned because of his racial origin, his political opinion, or his religious convictions. Immigrants and sons of immigrants from the Central European countries fought side by side with those who descended from the countries which were our allies, with the sons of equatorial Africa, and with the red men of our own aboriginal population, all of them equally proud of the name Americans. We must not, in times of peace, permit ourselves to lose any part from this structure of patriotic unity. I make no plea for leniency towards those who are criminal or vicious, are open enemies of society, and are not prepared to accept the true standards of our citizenship. Whether one traces his Americanism back to 3 centuries to the Mayflower or 3 years to the steerage is not half so important as whether his Americanism of today is real and genuine. Now, I'm not going to ask you to judge whether Coolidge is on the level, should we think he's the greatest guy in the world because of that, but does it reflect at all some cognitive dissonance in American public sentiment of the time in terms of how they viewed race and how they viewed immigration?
I think I understand. Are you asking me if assimilationist attitudes are different from racism?
Well, what he is saying is, I don't care if you're African American, I don't care if you're Native American, as long as you're American in spirit, that's good enough. Was that reflective of the attitude of the time, or was that kind of a cosmetic window dressing to mask underlying racism?
No, I think he was legitimately trying to take a moderate position, at least for the time. I think that was considered to be sort of a compromise, moderate position, where he's saying, I'm not racist as long as you act white. So there were plenty of people that were legitimately very racist and did not hold that position, and then there were people who probably thought that position was weak and a halfway house. But I've always understood Coolidge to see himself as holding a position that is trying not to alienate either side too much. And that's sort of what I was understanding Roz to be saying in terms of he's different than the nativist leader that we have now, because Calvin Coolidge was actually trying to build a coalition around a unified American identity, which we can critique from 100 years later. And certainly there's lots of ways we could talk about the ways in which the Indian Citizenship Act was incredibly assimilationist, the granting of citizenship to Puerto Ricans to force them to fight in World War I was incredibly problematic, right? But I think he was genuine. I don't have reason to believe he didn't hold that sentiment.
I guess just to bring you in, Roz, and also try to connect it to today, one of the main things I have a hard time getting my head around as far as our current situation is the Trump campaign actually diversified its base in this election. While either he or his allies were saying some very racist or bigoted things. And how do we look at the kind of somewhat contradictory views expressed in 1924 and the contradictory views expressed in 2024? Is there any parallels to make there and to help us understand the connection between these two eras?
That's a complicated question there. There seems to have been a early Coolidge and a later Coolidge when it comes to the issue of race and racial hierarchies. When he was a vice president, he would write these articles that were pretty crudely racist, where he would say things like, quote, "Observance of ethnic law is as great a necessity to a nation as immigration law," that we really need to pay attention to the ethnic background of somebody above and beyond their behavior, their observable values. Just where they come from is going to be a decisive factor in whether they can assimilate or not, which, is the definition of racism. Later, primarily after he does after he's president, he seems to switch towards a more, I don't care who you are as long as you act American, which again, like Rebecca said, we can criticize exactly what that means in his view, but he certainly moves away from this explicit statement that if you come from certain places, you don't belong here. Funny thing is, he signs a law that reduces drastically Italian immigration. He could read Italian. He read Dante in the original. I'm not sure current leadership can do that. Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, the key difference between these two moments, 100 years apart, that I think might get at what you're asking, is that in 1924, the focus was on eliminating legal immigration, right? Like they wanted to end immigration. And at the time, because we hadn't really gone very far down the road of numerical restrictions and quotas, we did not yet have very much illegality, right? There were some people coming into the United States from China still, and they were undocumented, but Chinese people were legally prevented from naturalizing anyway, and so they were perpetually going to be outsiders either way. Whereas once we put quotas on much of the countries that had been sending large numbers of people for decades, that produces illegality, right? So people still came from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Japan, from some of these countries outside of the quotas. They came up through Mexico. They came illegally into the country, and we start seeing a deportation apparatus being built after 1920, and that was going to be one of the other big sort of harbingers of our current moment that I was going to talk about is, so I pulled the numbers. In the year 1920, the United States only deported like 2,000 people the whole year. By 1930, that number was 40,000. So in just 6 years after the 1924 Act, we're already seeing much, much higher levels of deportation because certain people had been banned from coming who still wanted to come. And that is a problem now that's 100 years old. We now deport approximately 1.1 million people every year in the United States. And so the other thing that's really important to understand about 1924 is simultaneously with the act is the founding of the Border Patrol. We didn't have one before. And the Border Patrol was created to try to actually enforce the 1924 Act by preventing people from coming across the U.S.-Mexico border without a visa. And so now we're 100 years in to this concept of illegal immigration that has, over the course of this century, become completely, inextricably associated with Mexican ethnic identity. So it's a very racialized figure. And so I think Trump is able to run on, we're going to deal with the problem of illegal immigration and appeal to a broad base of people who don't see themselves as being part of that problem, right? So a lot of hand-wringing about, like, how could Latinos vote for Trump? Well, many Latinos in this country are multi-generational citizens of this United States. They came in legally, and they don't see themselves as having very much in common with an undocumented person from Central America. Not very much at all. Do I think that the current moment could be extended to target legal immigrants? Absolutely, I do. I think the rhetoric has been around illegality because that is very powerful. But let's be clear, Trump's immigration advisor, Stephen Miller, talks a lot about Calvin Coolidge as his idol. And he's specifically said that he frequently refers to Calvin Coolidge as someone that he looks up to as a role model because he signed the 1924 Act and shut down immigration. And so I think a lot of people voted for Trump because they don't think he's going to go after the type of immigrants they are or the type of immigrant background they have. And I mean, I hope for all of our sakes that I'm wrong, but I think that it can be very, very easily expanded from just looking at undocumented people to many, many more types of people who are legally present, including the first domino to fall is very obviously, to me, temporary protective status. There's a reason why he went after Haitians, not just because his opponent was a Black Caribbean woman, but also because Haitians are the poster children for the problematic temporary protective status.
So can you explain what that is?
Yeah, temporary protective status is a visa category that was created in the 1990s and has been extended to groups ostensibly on an emergency basis. So if there's a crisis in a country, a natural disaster, a hurricane, a coup, or something like that, the people who are already in the United States from that country can be granted legal status to stay. But it's not a path to citizenship. It's a limbo status, right? It's you're here, you're safe, you're legal for now, but the word temporary is right there in the title. The idea is that when conditions in the home country improve, you are no longer welcome to stay. Trump has very deftly pointed out that some of these temporary protective statuses have been extended for decades because, as it turns out, unstable countries don't actually just become stable enough to send people back to. And so he's like, what's temporary about it if you've been here for 20 years? It's never been a privileged visa category because there's no path to citizenship. But there's millions of people on TPS in the country right now, and he could get rid of it. Mm-hmm. Or similarly, the DACA program, which Obama created to provide legal residency for children who came over innocently with their parents or came over underage without documents. And there's millions of people in this country with that status as well. So these are legal statuses that could be easily targeted. So I don't think any of us should imagine that this targeting of immigration would be limited to the illegal population, but that's what the rhetoric focused on in the campaign, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Very much agree. The rhetoric focused on undocumented immigrants because that is the most politically expedient thing to do. But legal immigration in the U.S. during the Trump administration was deeply affected. This is not just something that is likely to happen in the future. It has happened during those 4 years. Basically, every aspect of legal immigration was damaged, delayed, made more costly, made more time-consuming. At every stage of the legal immigration system, whether you were applying for a green card, a temporary green card, a permanent green card, citizenship, doing your medical check for an application, your biometric, where they take your fingerprints and irises, print. All of these stages of legal immigration were fraught with delays. The fees increased all the time. Most people, I think, do not know that the legal immigration system is self-financing. It does not receive money from the budget, but receives money from the fees paid by the immigrants who are applying to become citizens, to become green card holders, permanent residents. So people were fired, agencies were narrowed down. The work of legal immigration was very much obstructed, so that legal immigration, as well as undocumented immigration, slows down immensely. At some point, the Trump administration lawyers went in front of the Supreme Court arguing that the administration should be given the authority to unnaturalize already naturalized citizens if they can prove that these individuals had committed at some point in their life a crime. Because on the form, when you apply for citizenship, there's a question that says, have you ever committed a crime? Have you ever been cited, arrested, charged, convicted of a crime? It doesn't matter that you were never found guilty, or you were arrested by mistake, or you were forgiven, or it's not meant to necessarily stop you from getting citizenship, but you must disclose. There's no way in which you can argue that you should be allowed to get away with not telling the U.S. government about your run-in with the law. But that extends to, they do ask, have you ever committed a crime? Now, every time I get into a car, I commit a crime. Technically speaking, I don't come to a full stop all the time at a stop sign. Justice Roberts, Chief Justice, not exactly a flaming liberal, asked incredulously, do you mean to say that if 20 years ago I drove 10 miles over the speed limit, and you somehow, can prove that, and I haven't disclosed my crime, as petty as it is, on that form, do you want the authority? Are you arguing that you would like the authority to potentially take away my citizenship on the grounds that I have lied on the form? And the Trump administration lawyer said, well, yeah, that's the law. And the response from the Chief Justice was, that's ridiculous. Because he perceived, evidently, that was a sword of Damocles that could be forever held over the head of all immigrants, especially the troublesome ones. So the assault on legal immigration is very much in the cards, although not as politically easy on the eye as the assault on undocumented immigration, where you can show incorrectly sometimes that these people have committed a crime. And I say incorrectly because while crossing the border illegally, not where you're supposed to be crossing it, is a federal misdemeanor, overstaying your visa is not a felony, is a civil infraction that is way below, on par maybe with traffic infractions, like not coming to a full stop. And that is because that's how the U.S. Congress has decided it should be, Republican and Democrat, over, the entire history of the U.S. So even the assault on undocumented immigrants is done under false pretenses at times.
I want to turn the clock back because the line from 1924 to 2024 is not a straight line. A lot of stuff happens in the middle. And we do have this period that's bookended with 1965 where laws get more liberalized. Can you talk more about what happened in between those points? We've mentioned that Jewish refugees were blocked. The war happens. There's a yo-yo effect with Mexican immigration where it comes up and it comes down. How is this affecting public opinion about immigration, and how does that lead to enough will to radically change these laws in 1965?
So the act reduced immigrant population from what was roughly 15% of the United States population in 1924 to about 5% when this law was finally repealed in 1965. In between, lots of things happened. World War II happened, which came with its own yo-yo in public opinion, a fear of German Americans, Japanese Americans, but then the victory in the war and an economic boom and need for labor and no more need to fear foreigners anymore. And we're making friends with everybody, including the Germans and the Japanese. So the public opinion wasn't just paying attention to immigration. It was paying attention to world affairs.
Does the Cold War have an impact here? Is there a desire to welcome people fleeing communist places?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think for me, there's like 4 factors. So the first is the beginning of the end of the Asian bar is the War Brides Act that allows American GIs to bring their Japanese wives home. And so those are the first Japanese people to be allowed to come to the United States since 1924. And people start saying like, oh, it's not so bad to have some Japanese people, right? It's seen as a patriotic thing to allow Japanese women to come, and also some German women as well, who the War Brides Act is 46, I want to say. And then, so that was thing number 1. Oh, the Hungarian Revolution, in which the United States brings over massive amounts of Hungarians in sort of an emergency way. And that's, again, some of the first large numbers of Eastern Europeans that have been allowed to come in decades. And so there's these changes that occur that lead up to 1965 that are really important. And then once we get to the 1960s, the Cold War is a huge factor because Stalin is saying things like, look at how racist the United States is. Like, he's talking explicitly about how racist the United States is. And yes, most of that is in reference to Jim Crow and racism towards black people. But the 1924 Act is perceived in the popular imagination by the 1960s as also pretty racist, as like part of the thing that is embarrassing about the United States, is record on race. And then, so I would also say that the civil rights movement is hugely significant in leading to the end of the 1924 national origins quotas, because the 3 big acts that are like the 3 prongs of the civil rights legislative agenda are, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then the Immigration Act of 1965, which is sold by Lyndon Johnson to the American public as like the 3rd leg of that stool, as righting the wrong of racialization of our immigration law and making it egalitarian and eliminating racial bars and quotas from our immigration law as part of our civil rights agenda. And he famously says it won't really change the face of America at all. He stands under the Statue of Liberty and is like, don't worry, everyone. This is just a symbolic thing. We're getting rid of the racism in our law. And within a few decades, we see like a complete 180 on the demographics of the United States. So I think that was wrong. He did not understand what he was doing.
You think he wasn't being disingenuous? He thought
no, they genuinely didn't understand what they did. I could talk about that for hours. But yeah, for me, those are the 4 things: the War Brides Act, the Hungarians, the Cold War, and the Civil Rights Movement.
I'll just add 2 things. It wasn't just Stalin who thought that the 24 Act was great. Hitler also thought it was a great thing. He mentioned it himself. The Nazis, when they created the Nuremberg racial laws, specifically, took inspiration from the Immigration Act. And the second thing I'd like to emphasize is what you were talking about, the Hungarian refugees. That was probably the biggest, or one of the biggest impetus in America taking seriously the idea of a refugee program. It was a big population, like you said, that America felt had to be rescued suddenly.
Not
quickly.
unrelated to the Cold War.
Not, of course. And Jews in the Soviet Union, and Protestants in the Soviet Union, and so on, which led to America doing something that it hadn't done in the 1924 Act, which is to create a separate track for refugees, which are a very misunderstood category of people. These days, they are assimilated very much in the public imagination with asylum seekers at the border, with migrants who cross the border illegally and then claim asylum. Not the same population as the refugees who are picked up by the United States from refugee camps in other countries that had been given the official designation of refugee by the United Nations, and then America receives them. The Trump administration set the lowest possible at that time cap on refugee admissions, so that's another thing we would expect. Biden brought it back up. We would expect that cap to go down as well, regardless
Christians
of what's
only.
happening. Christians only, yeah, were happening. More than, I think, 50-something% of the refugees that were coming into the United States at that time were Christians, mostly Christians from the Middle East, which, as you might remember, Vice President Mike Pence and his interest group of people were particularly sensitive towards saving Christians from ISIS and other oppressive groups in the Middle East. So the 1924 Act did not provide anything for refugees, which led, as you mentioned in the introduction, led to a lot of Jewish refugees taking refuge from the rise of Nazism and fascist regimes elsewhere in Europe to be rejected by the United States. Jews were coming from Germany. Has the quota for Germany been filled? Yes, it has. No more Germans. Of course, these were Jews running from the Germans, but they were not received. And the famous case of the St. Louis ship that was turned around, and historians have tracked down what happened to the Jews on that boat that were denied entrance to the United States, and the vast majority ended up in concentration and extermination camps back in Europe. As a direct result of that, the United States took the lead in helping create the Convention for the Status of Refugees, on which current American refugee law is based. And there's much to say about current American refugee law, because it says some things that a lot of Americans are not familiar with, which explains why we're having such debates about, can you just kick out people? And the short answer is no, you can't. They have guaranteed due process rights under American law, and if you were to just kick people out, you would be breaking American law, the same exact thing you accuse people who cross the law illegally of doing.
I want to ask two more questions. Let's try to keep the answers short, because I want to give time to folks for Q&A. One of them is going to be refugee related, but I want to hold off on that because I want to go a little bit chronologically. You mentioned how Stephen Miller, Trump's one of his top aides, looks up to Coolidge. Ronald Reagan hung a portrait of Coolidge in the White House, but he, I would say, mainly was pro-immigrant. It's not totally black and white, but did sort of speak about it. I mean, his farewell address was very pro-immigrant. He enacted the 1986 amnesty that legalized undocumented immigrants who were here. Does that say something about where America, the Republican Party, was between the 1920s and the 1980s?
Yes. It's hard to decide between guns and immigration which of those two issues the Republican Party has just gone off the deep end on in the past few decades more than the other. I think they're neck and neck. But Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were both pretty open to immigration, as good libertarians would be, right? I mean, this is the thing. For the longest, I grew up, when I first started studying immigration 20-something years ago, we talked about it as a cross-cutting issue, one in which there were some Republicans that were against, usually the nativists, the xenophobes, but most Republicans were for because it was good for business to have open borders, because labor flows should flow freely like capital. And then it cross-cut the Democrats because there were people who were in favor of racial equality, and then people who are more concerned about low-wage workers, and historically the labor movement fell into this category, would be more concerned about immigration. And what I've seen in the past quarter century is that cross has actually now moved so that it's completely a partisan issue. Yeah, and so the Wall Street Journal editorial page wing of the Republican Party is like nowhere to be found right now. And the only, the Wall Street Journal, open borders, libertarian wing of the Republican Party is missing in action. And I think they're the only thing that can stop a mass deportation is the business sector saying, what are you, insane? You deport 11 million people. Our agricultural sector collapses, our construction sector collapses, our hospitality, etc. And if the business wing of the Republican Party can gather itself to resist this, that's much more likely to stop a mass deportation than anything else.
Do you want to jump in, or should I just go to the next question? So in talking about refugees, and just as a side point, so when a refugee is highly vetted for years through the UN and the US, apparatuses before, and the intention is permanent settlement, whereas an asylum seeker is literally just showing up saying, I'm in a jam. I want to take advantage of international law and American law to have my claim adjudicated. And since that is sort of an inherently more improv, chaotic process, that's where a lot of the people's agita tends to focus on, whereas refugees, there can be a negative connotation with the word refugee, but it's a totally different program. But that sort of gets to how complicated, and we've talked already, temporary protective status, refugee, asylum, and that's only like the tip of the iceberg as far as all the different classifications that exist. Like, none of this was around in 1924. Was it the 1965 law that begins to make the immigration process more bureaucratic?
Well, it's a gradual process, but a lot of things actually started with the 1924, like visas. It was the 1924 Act, and Coolidge was a big proponent of this particular element of the Act that said, you know what, the best way to stop the undesirable immigrants, the ones we don't want, is to stop them at their point of origin, to vet them there rather than to vet them here. Let's not vet them at Ellis Island, let's vet them in Italy, right? So they created consular offices, what we now know as American consulates, who are going to interview you and are going to adjudicate whether you deserve a visa to enter the United States or not. That was the creation of the 1924 Act. The Border Patrol, as Rebecca said, that actually actively patrols the border and acts as an interdiction.
And 100 miles inland.
Right, and 100 miles inland, which covers all of New England, will actually was created around that time as well. So much of that bureaucracy did start in 1924, just 100 years ago. It's not a whole lot of time. But since then, yes, there were, like I said, there was no provision for refugees. That came after World War II, when the horrors of the Holocaust were becoming evident, and people said never again, and they created the Geneva Convention for the status of refugees.
Love to get some questions if people have questions. Do we have, is that mic functioning, or should I just use this mic? This is on a wire, I think. Okay, well, for the folks on the YouTube, I just want to make sure they can hear the question.
We can repeat the question.
This is just a bit of history question. Were there any exceptions for scientists or brilliant people coming from Germany during the war years? Because I was surprised that the first thing you mentioned was Hungary, but there had been, I believe, quite a wave of important people, and who became quite important.
Yes.
How do you square that?
Yes, and I'm gonna let my colleague answer this, but I'll just say this one thing about the 1924 Act, which never ceases to tickle me, is that it made exceptions for clergy. So if you're a member of the clergy, you could come in. You were not covered by the quotas, and get this, college professors. I just love the idea that when you cap immigration, you let the college professors go. I wonder if that would be the case now. You know what? Of all the people we want in this country, let's have more college professors.
I mean, that's what I was about to say. It's the clergy and the college professors.
So you mean after World War II? During World War II. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I presume so, but
I don't actually know. The German scientists who worked on the landing on the moon project, I assume, is something you might be referring to.
Yeah, if there's one thing I can say with certainty about American immigration law is, for every rule, there's an exception.
And then there's an exception to that exception.
There's discretion, and so it's very difficult to say, yes, this never happened,
Questions about musicians?
No.
Hey, so I'm curious what y'all have to say about how this compares with Israel, unnaturalizing Palestinian citizens of Israel, and if you think that might have any kind of impact on what happens here in the coming days. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, my question is about, so this is about Trump's threatening to unnaturalize citizens and immigrants here. And I'm wondering what you think, if you think there will be any impact on the U.S. in regards to Israel's decision to unnaturalize Palestinian Israeli citizens.
I mean, I don't think that the U.S. is very influenced by the actions of other countries, especially not with Trump in power. I mean, what I'll say is denaturalization is a tool of fascism, in my opinion, and make of that what you will.
I had like a second part of that also. I was wondering what you have to say about the fact that we have a president who is a felon and utilizing this like, oh, we're going to deport anyone who has committed a crime.
Ironic.
What did you say?
It's very ironic.
Yes.
I don't know. I feel like there's going to be so much more to say when we see what he actually does. I'm really trying to walk a fine line between letting my imagination spiral to all of the absolute worst possible case scenarios, but also knowing that that doesn't really help anyone, and predicting things can cause a lot of like real panic in people who worry they might be affected by them. And so I just,
Do you think he'll have a logistical problem in meeting the goals that he has sketched out? I mean, he promised 2 million criminal deportations in the first term when he got nowhere near that. Is there a person power issue with doing that kind of mass deportation?
there's a huge logistical problem with it. That doesn't mean he won't try. I think I've heard Roz answer this question a couple of times, and I think you do it quite well. So I'm going to let you take this one.
I just say I would keep my eyes on whether there is a large-scale, sustained workplace raids, meaning not just once in a while, but sustained raids on fields, agricultural fields, food-related companies, processing plants, meat packing, and so on, where a lot of undocumented immigrants are employed. But, of course, those are the business interests you were talking about. So it's a touchy subject for the incoming administration, and I cannot predict whether we're going to engage in mostly performative acts of apprehension of undocumented immigrants at the border. The background of the border and the agents chasing undocumented immigrants who are sneaking through the border would be a highly effective visual. The more actually effective anti-undocumented immigrant action, the one that would get to the mass element of mass deportation, would be large-scale workplace raids that happened during Trump, but did not happen in any sustained way that would indicate that he was being serious about mass deportation, not just deportation. Because deportation, Obama, of course, did plenty of it, Biden did plenty of it. If this is going to be a scale of magnitude bigger than what Biden has been doing and what Obama did before, that's where I would be looking for indications.
I'll just add that in order to, as Ross says, deport people, you do have to put them through a deportation hearing. And so you can't just round people up and literally in the same action take people across the border. So if mass deportation is actually something that's mobilized, that will require I'll call them internment camps, concentration camps. We've had that before in the United States within the past century with the Japanese internment, and it is still precedent that the president, working with Congress as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, has the ability to do that. And I've been thinking a lot recently about the dissent in that case that upheld the power to intern people in large numbers, and Justice Jackson's dissent in particular, in which he says this precedent will lie in our law like a loaded weapon, waiting for a less honorable, less scrupulous president to do evil with it. And I think this might be a moment where we find out how true that is.
Russ?
Yeah. My question is, do you have any examples throughout world history where there was very large immigration into a certain area and the people coming in were different than the people, the country they were entering in any way, religion, race, whatever have you, where the country that was having that happen to them didn't have a strong nativist reaction? And if there is an example or examples, is there anything we can learn from those countries that might help us deal with the nativist reaction that we're seeing now?
So I have a colleague who studies responses to mass arrivals And she's done Lamis Abdelati at Syracuse University, and she's written an amazing book on this called Discrimination and Delegation. And she did like a large-scale quantitative analysis of this, and she found that countries are much more willing to accept large numbers of an influx, if you will, of border crossers when the group in question is ethnically aligned with the political party in power in the receiving state, and the sending country's leadership is an enemy of the receiving state. Those are the factors. So you're right to say that there's not a good long track record of people welcoming ethnic others unless they're fleeing someone that you want to flag as bad. And if neither of those two things are true, no, there's no examples of people welcoming others who don't serve a political purpose.
There's very few countries in the world that would say now what Thomas Paine said in 1776, extrapolating from Europe to the world, saying that the world is the parent country of our country, rather than the ethnic group, the dominant ethnic group. To this day, the American experiment is not 100% unique, but close. Canada and Australia and New Zealand are giving America a run for its money. But those are comparatively small countries by population. There's different pressures at work there. The U.S. still is by far the biggest destination of migrants, of refugees, of basically every category of people on the move in the world. So in terms of percentage, the U.S. is, I think, third in the world in terms of percentage of immigrants, people born in another country, after Canada and Australia. But in terms of sheer numbers, of course, it's by far the first. So the comparisons with other countries are always fraught because America is supposed to not be like other countries. We're supposed to be an alternative to the European ethnocentrism. That is putatively why so many ethnic and religious groups left those countries, because they weren't welcomed by the majority. So it's useful to compare, but only up to a point. I think it's much more productive to compare America to its own ideals on one hand and to its own history on the other hand.
More questions? A lot of questions. Julia's coming with the microphone.
Was the immigration law directed towards nations or nationalities?
Recognized countries.
Say that again, please.
Recognized countries.
Against countries.
Countries.
So that, like Austria, Hungary, they had many nationalities within that country, and Austria was limited to so many people that could leave, and it made no difference what their nationality was. They were Austrian.
That's right. And the biggest effect, the starkest effect that you could see there was the Jewish population of Europe. They did not have a country of their own, and they were considered to be members of whatever country they were citizens or residents of, which posed lots of issues given that so many Jews at the time were running from those countries because they were not allowed to become citizens, they were denationalized or just generally oppressed by incoming fascist movements.
Also, how could one prepare to leave Austria, say, and go to America with a guaranteed entrance, or did they have to prepare in some way and get a permit or something to indicate that, that they would at least be entertained and interviewed for entrance.
Yes, the 1924 law provided for, as I mentioned, visas. You had to be interviewed at a consular spot in your home country, or the closest to you if there was none in your home country. And the law explicitly mentions that the fact that you have a visa, something that is true to this day, does not guarantee entrance to the United States. Guarantees you an interview with a border official. Same exact situation right now. You can get a visa to come to the United States, but the border agent has discretionary power to decline, to deny you entrance, even though you cannot say, but I have a visa. Because he'll say, so what? I still have the power to reject your entrance. And that was introduced in 1924.
Good, thank you.
You have a few more?
The immigrants that are fleeing persecution from Afghanistan, Syria, Haiti, Yemen, do they have special status?
There are some, yes, there's some temporary and some permanent programs. So if they're refugees ascertained as such by the United Nations, then the U.S. can track them, can put them on the refugee track if they want to. Then there's emergency parole programs like the one that Biden introduced after the U.S. military left Afghanistan, and a lot of vulnerable people were left behind. Lots of pressure. You remember the disastrous pullout from Afghanistan. Biden put in place a parole program for a lot of Afghanis to be airlifted, the biggest airlift in American history to overcome that of Vietnamese after the fall of Saigon. That was one of Biden's hot and cold strategy elements. On one hand, he enforced deportation and closed the border and adopted so many of the Trump era measures that he had decried when he was running against Trump. On the other hand, he developed a lot of parole programs that allow people into the country or who are already into the country legally to regularize their status, including people from Haiti, people from Afghanistan. TPS is designed to address exactly what you're saying, people who are coming from countries in deep crisis. The problem with that is that the T in TPS stands for temporary, and that is at the discretion of the president through the Department of State. This is a designation that is granted by the Department of State, which means that a different administration can revoke it. It's not law, as in, done by Congress. So the answer is yes, there are special programs, but they are extremely fragile and vulnerable and probably on the chopping block within the coming year.
I'll just add to that. The way I always explain it is, in terms of visa options in the United States, we have a very wide net with a lot of holes. And so it's a very complicated system with an alphabet soup of options for visas that some people are sometimes eligible for and other people may not be, but maybe at a different time. And really the only way to navigate it is to have a really competent immigration attorney to help you navigate it, because I've been studying this for 25 years and I still can't tell a person who comes to me and asks for immigration advice exactly how to proceed. It's that complicated. So some Afghans, yes. Many, no. Some are seeking asylum. Some have special parole. Some have a special humanitarian visa. It's just so complicated. And as Roz says, that makes a lot of these visa options very, very vulnerable, because they're not like permanently embedded in our law. They're like creations that spring out of a particular moment, and the rug can be pulled out on them.
Hey there. I got two questions. One's real quick. Dr. Hamlin, you said earlier about the open border libertarian business owner Republicans were kind of like a sign of hope that you kind of had. To stand up against Yeah, no, because historically they usually use immigration as like a cudgel to keep wages low. And I didn't know if there was something that gave you this idea that you kind of implied, and I might be being misinterpreting what you said earlier.
What I was trying to say was that if there's a force at work that might convince Donald Trump not to actually attempt a multi-million person mass deportation, it's not going to be people on the left protesting and saying, but that's not nice. It's not going to be, I do not believe that's going to change his mind. What might change his mind is business elites whispering in his ear, for the love of God, don't do this. I'm not saying that those business elites have the best interests of immigrants at heart. All I meant was they're more likely to be able to stop it than I am.
That's much clearer. Thank you. The question I actually did have was about the was it the 1947 thing which allowed kind of created the refugee status? How that the 1924 bill interacted with that UN decree from, was it Convention of Immigrants, or I can't remember the exact title off the top of my head.
Absolutely. So in 1951, there's a delegation of European powers and the United States and Canada that get together and create the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is for the it's not the first time, but it's the first truly global international legal definition of a refugee that many, many countries pledge to adopt. Ironic, and it is done in the aftermath of World War II, and certainly making a very strong nod to the idea of never again with the Holocaust. But it is absolutely a product of the Cold War, and it's about providing states with a tool in their arsenal to be able to condemn a sending country and say, you're not treating your people well, we will take them. And so it is really designed with the idea in mind that countries will accept refugees from communism and thus critique communism. And ironically, the United States participates in the drafting of the 1951 Refugee Convention and then cares not to sign it because they decide they're going to decide for themselves what a refugee is, and for many years afterwards continue to define in our law a refugee as someone fleeing communism. That sits in our law until 1980. And so we actually, whilst being a very key participant in the creation of the concept of a refugee in international law, actually don't use it until officially the 1980 Refugee Act, which is championed by Massachusetts Senator Edward Kennedy, finally gets rid of the fleeing communism element of our definition and replaces it with the 1951 definition. Ronald Reagan still refuses to accept this and is like, no, we're only going to take people fleeing communism, though. Like, it doesn't matter what the law says. And so, truly, the international definition of a refugee does not start being applied in U.S. law in any meaningful way until really the end of the Cold War. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my rant on it, yeah.
And I have one question from an online viewer tonight, and he wants to know about how immigration in 1924 affected unionizing and labor. So prior to the 24 Act, we had high numbers of immigrants in factories unable to make gains in unionizing, and by the 1930s, that kind of changes, and we have a lot more immigrant labor being able to organize. So how did this reduction in people coming really affect labor and the legacy of that?
It's complicated because these groups were not homogenous themselves, and I would expand a little from the labor unions to ethnic groups, to activists within different ethnic groups. from the point of view of the 1924 Act, we're talking about Italian Americans and Jewish Americans. The problem, as I said, is that these groups were not politically homogenous, especially the Italian Americans at the time. Fascism, Mussolini's fascism was rising. It was coming to power in Italy, and the Italian American community split down the middle between pro-fascists back at home who were happy at what was happening back at home, and people who thought it was horrific. And that hampered their coming together to fight the 1924 quotas. There were high-profile Jewish Americans and Italian Americans who did manage to form tenuous alliances, temporary alliances, to push back against the 1924 act that was limiting immigration from those countries. Just like Rebecca was saying, Japan, the country of Japan, was highly irritated by this Immigration Act. Italy was making noises as well, but again, Italy was also going through transformations. And the Central and Eastern European countries where the Jewish population was coming from were also lodging complaints. My home country of Romania was complaining officially to the United States about the 1924 Act. The labor movement itself, while had a strong socialist component, that of course that was perceived as the enemy by the framers of the 1924 Immigration Act. It wasn't just Catholics and Jews, it was Catholic and Jewish socialists, anarchists, and Bolsheviks. So that element of the labor movement was trying to push back, but it was also very much embroiled in internal fights with elements of the labor movement, as Rebecca said before, who had been against immigration because, hey, we're here, we're Americans, and we don't need more low-wage immigrants to take our jobs. So the short answer is that there was pushback from labor unions, but it was not effective. And it dissipated quickly, and then World War II came, and all bets were off, a war economy, everything changed, including the nature and the priorities of the labor movement.
Any other questions? I have one, two.
Is there an annual quota now for immigrants? And if so, how has that changed over the decades?
Yes, since 1965, this is part of my spiel on the 1965 Act. So we got rid of this racist law, the 1924 law, and replaced it with egalitarian, equal quotas for every country, which it doesn't take long to figure out is highly problematic because Liechtenstein and China are going to have different levels of demand, right? And even beyond just the population base of different countries, the demand, the interest from those countries in coming here varies tremendously. And so, yes, we have egalitarian quotas since 1965 for each country. And on top of that, what we have is non-quota immigration. So if you're an immediate family member of someone who's here as a citizen, they can sponsor you, and it doesn't count against the quota. But if you don't have the good fortune to have an immediate family member who can sponsor you, then you're subject to the quota. And the quotas for countries like Mexico, the Philippines, China, India are meaningless in the sense that they mimic what I was speaking about earlier with the quotas for like Estonia being hundreds of years long in their wait lists. And so when people say get in line, they're talking about getting in a quota line that will outlast their life expectancy.
And that is just to receive consideration, not permission to come into the country. So get in line means turn in your file at the American consulate, wait 85 years, and you will get an interview that will reject you.
Do you have any suggestions on a better system?
Oh, yeah.
What's the ideal immigration law, one audience member asks?
In 5 minutes or less.
Please don't ask that when we are 1 million light years away from it. Mm.
We would need to have a good faith discussion, about assimilation, about numbers. Do we have room in this country? Yes, we do. About we don't have a Secretary of Immigration. Given how big a deal immigration seems to be for everybody, including Trump, right? It's amazing that we don't have a Secretary of Immigration. Now, the office that deals with immigration was initially in the Labor Department because it was a labor issue. That's what we were concerned about, was, are these people going to take jobs, are going to help the economy? Then it moved to the Attorney General, then it moved in enforcement, right? Because we were concerned about criminality. Not so much about taking jobs away from us, but criminality. And then 9/11 happened, and immigration moved into the newly created Homeland Security, because now we were afraid not so much of them taking our jobs and killing us, but committing acts of terrorism. So now they were potential terrorists, right? And this is where it's at to this day. The offices that deal with immigration are in Homeland Security. And to some extent the State Department, but primarily Homeland Security. A step forward would be taking them away from those departments which only know how to do one thing: labor, policing, terrorism, and security, and making it its own department, and then having people there who are going to take an objective look at how many people do we want, who do we want, who do we not want, which of course is a very fraught question. Can we have rational programs of distribution of immigrants? I find it absolutely shocking that Massachusetts, a very liberal state, is, by all accounts, dealing with with an asylum seeker crisis around Boston, and yet 2 hours down the pike, this area has never seen any concerted effort from the state authorities of Massachusetts, liberal people who are not to be suspected of being anti-immigrant, to organize some sort of action to relieve the pressures on shelters in Eastern Mass, on their systems. Nobody, and I try to be informed of what's happening in this area about immigration. Nobody is asking town halls around this area, could you tell us how many asylum seekers that we are currently hosting in Boston can you accommodate? Give us a list of jobs that you have available. Ask your residents of Northampton who might be able to provide housing for 6 months. What is the situation in Northampton and Amherst? Can you take some of them? That doesn't happen 2 hours away from the crisis point in the most liberal state in America, right? If that was to be a whole of country effort, where we had a good faith discussion of how many immigrants can we take, how many refugees can we take, what kind of refugees should they be, should it be merit-based or family-based, could we incentivize them to go to certain areas, to work in certain industries, rather than to go to Boston and New York City and San Francisco. Those discussions can be had in a legitimate way by all parties. That includes restrictionists, people who would rather see us slow down with immigration. It is true that the rate of immigration right now is almost at an all-time high. Right? We are having a large section of our population be immigrants. So there is a legitimate way in which people who are maybe not 100% okay with that and would like us to slow down and do more work in assimilated immigrants, that discussion can be had. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, it is now a political football, and that legitimate discussion is nowhere to be seen, not even in Massachusetts.
I'll just say I've made studying immigration my life's work for a reason, and that reason is in part because I think it's endlessly fascinating because there aren't easy answers. And I also I find it endlessly fascinating because it asks us to grapple with like some of the most difficult questions there are, like how comfortable are we with massive amounts of inequality when it comes to wealth and stability in the world, and how much violence are we willing to tolerate to protect our privilege. And so what I always say to my students is, think about precisely how much. Like, are you comfortable with what we do now, which is to literally put blockers in the Rio Grande River that purposefully drown people who try to cross it? I'm not, right? Are you comfortable with immigration enforcement officers going into people's homes, ripping apart families and parents from their children, literally tearing mothers away from their children, out of workplaces, out of their bedrooms? I'm not. And so it is difficult for me to imagine an ideal immigration system when that is what is currently happening and about to get even more dramatically the case. I would like to see us be able to have like these actually really difficult conversations about why it is that so many people desire to come here, and the legacies of colonialism and imperialism and starting wars all over the world that lead people to not feel like they can stay where they are. And we're just so far away from actually talking about root causes. And until there comes a time when we can ever grapple with why migration is such a big feature of our global reality right now, I just feel very hopeless that we're even close to being we could make tweaks, but I don't think we can really solve it anytime soon, unfortunately. I know that's a really bleak way to end things.
It's hard to do an immigration panel without it ending on a bleak note.
These days.
Yeah.
These days. We could have more humane borders than we have. It is not an open borders thing to say that we could spend some of the literally we spend $20 billion a year on border enforcement at the border, and that does not include internal enforcement like ICE. I can think of a lot of things we could do with $20 billion that could get more at root causes and make our border crossing situations more humane without opening borders. And I mean, if there's one thing that I could get across, and I doubt that this is the room that needs to hear it the most, but President or candidate Trump kept calling Biden open borders. Biden, our borders are far from open. People are dying trying to get across them because they're not open. It's simply untrue. You can debate a lot of things about immigration. It's not true that our borders are open.
The U.S.-Mexico border is the most lethal land border in the world.
In the most heavily surveilled space on Earth possible. Well, one of
border. That is the opposite of an open border. People do slip in. Yes, that does happen as well.
What's that, Julie? Okay, we got to clear up. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I just want to say very quickly, we also host here a presidential book club every month. We're currently on Polk. We're doing Polk in a couple of weeks. If you want to get on that action, that's on Monday, November 25th. And if you want to hear more of our Coolidge Centennial panels, they're on the Forbes Library YouTube channel. And we'll let you know when the next one is going to be scheduled. Thank you so much.
We need to keep our roadshow going.